The topic of this video was recently discussed in a thread on Twitter, and it's also something I've been thinking about for a while myself personally. The great Dr. Thomas Sowell was never discussed in my family growing up, and he also wasn't discussed at my HBCU. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Anwar Youssef Dunbar, and this is Big Discussions 76, my original channel. First of all, please like this video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. Well, this promises to be a very interesting video, one that might alienate some people, but it's an important topic nonetheless. Once again, I just want to remind viewers that on this channel right here, I now discuss general topics, thoughts of the day, financial literacy / money, personal stories, and current events. So I guess this one would fall under thoughts of the day, though it's a thought that I've been having for a while now. I originally shot this video yesterday with just some points scribbled on my yellow notepad, and I decided to just put the actual points down in a logical format in a Word file and reshoot it because it's a very, very important discussion. So the original idea for this video, or should I say the genesis, whichever you want to use, came from my blog post regarding the law of compounding interest, which is a very, very, very important financial principle. And if you're unfamiliar with the law of compounding interest, I would encourage you to read that blog post. I'm going to leave it in the description box below. In that blog post, before getting into the law of compounding interest, I talk about a discussion I had with a classmate at the University of Michigan when I was in graduate school in the Department of Pharmacology. And actually this person was a lab mate. And his name was Damon. I'll just say his name was Damon. Those of us from the department will know who Damon is. Interestingly, I joked in the blog post that coming from Buffalo's east side, all of the Damons that I knew up to that point were black, but this Damon was of Greek descent. So Damon and I, we talked about a lot of things as our experiments were running. I specifically remember the HPLC running, and us just, being at the workbench in that part of the lab, just talking and bouncing topics back and forth. And I learned a lot from Damon. Damon went to Colgate University, and I guess you could describe Damon as conservative, as a conservative individual politically. But he was also very well learned and very well read. He was very opinionated. He had a snarky sense of humor, similar to mine, a dry sense of humor, and a bit of a temper, especially when his experiments didn't go well. But I learned a lot from him. We talked about money. My first discussion regarding the law of compounding interest came from Damon. It didn't sink in until years later when I started thinking about investing myself and retiring and getting my retirement savings going. But we talked about that. He gave me my first lesson on that. We talked about geopolitics, particularly the Middle East. We talked about higher education. We talked about where society is going and everything like that. So everything under the sun, me and Damon, we talked about. And coming from Buffalo's east side in the household that I came from, which was a Democratic household, none of Damon's ideas or comments bothered me because my mind was always so malleable, and it was always open to hearing new ideas regardless of who the ideas came from. And that's going to be a major theme of this video. But in the course of one conversation, Damon mentioned the great Dr. Thomas Sowell. I think we were talking about reading and what people were majoring in college and those kinds of things. And he said, you know, you should read Inside American Education by Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's a black professor from the Hoover Institute. And I looked at him and I said, who's Thomas Sowell? He said, you never heard of Thomas Sowell? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, okay, well, I will bring the book in for you so you can read it yourself. And sure enough, Damon brought the book in, and it was the hardcover, and I flipped it over, and sure enough, there was Dr. Thomas Sowell in his glasses and his afro. And so I took the book home, and I gradually read through it, and it was a very good read. And anyone who is interested in learning about education and some of the things that might be wrong with our education system here in the United States, that's a good read. Some of the main talking points I remember from that book were that our schools need to get back to teaching reading, writing, and math, and not so much all of the other things, such as all of the social dogma. Many of our institutions of higher learning are giving degrees and majors that really aren't worth much, and which are pretty much useless. And also, it's important for students to go to universities that their abilities match up well with, as opposed to forcing students into schools where they will have a hard time competing, which ultimately will cause frustration for them and also for their classmates. So, you know, that was a good book. I recommend it, but this was my first introduction to Dr. Thomas Sowell, a black intellectual, an economist, and a great thinker. I first learned about him in graduate school at my PWI, my predominantly white institution, and this was after graduating from my HBCU, my historically black college, and this was after 18 years of growing up on Buffalo's east side. So if you haven't, please like this video. The likes are free, and they help this video and my channel ascend in YouTube's algorithm. So I thought about wearing a t-shirt from my HBCU, but I decided to go with this Michigan Pharmacology t-shirt because this is where I first heard about the great Dr. Thomas Sowell. And I know that some people, depending upon their political affiliations, may bristle when I say the great Dr. Thomas Sowell, but I'm a fan, and I think that he's great. So, the significance, in terms of the significance about not hearing anything about him at my HBCU. So, before I shot this video, I was thinking, you know, just because I didn't hear about him at my HBCU, Johnson C. Smith University, it doesn't mean that no one had mentioned him. He might have been mentioned over in some of the business majors and courses. He might have been mentioned over in some of the humanities related courses, but I was in general biology, so there was no discussion of him over there, and none of my peers at that school, at my HBCU, on the yard, talked about Dr. Thomas Sowell. And so when I think about, not hearing about him at my HBCU, I think about selective history. So that is selectively telling certain parts while omitting other parts. Now that's just my HBCU, but since reading inside American Education, and which was when I was in my mid-20s, since then I have not really heard him, aside from interviews I've seen of him on YouTube, I have not heard much association of him with Howard University. And it turns out that Dr. Sowell is a graduate of Howard University. He went there for undergrad, I believe, and then he went up to Harvard to continue his studies. So it's very, very interesting that you don't hear a lot about that. Now, I'm not over at Howard taking classes, so it could be that he's talked about regularly on the campus, but in listening to the media and in my social circles, I never really hear him discussed much in relation to Howard University. And Howard is considered the Mecca and perhaps the flagship HBCU. You always hear about the celebrities showing up on the yard for homecoming. You hear about Diddy giving commencement speeches and those kinds of things. But I haven't really heard that much about Dr. Sowell in relation to Howard University. And again, I'm not over there all the time, so it could be that they talk about him. I'm just not privy to it. Now, I'm going to draw a parallel here to Dr. Claude Anderson. The same thing is true at my HBCU. I didn't really hear anything about Dr. Claude Anderson when I was there. And I think I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in this video. So in terms of, now before I go to my family, our HBCUs, historically black colleges, the thought process when you go to one and when you talk about those institutions is that you're going to hear and learn about African American / black history in the United States. And so you would think that those institutions are vehicles for teaching our history. But so it's a bit of a head scratcher when you don't hear about certain black people at your HBCUs. Okay. I just wanted to throw that in there. So in terms of the significance of not hearing about Dr. Sowell in my family, again, this is not to demonize my family or criticize my family, but I think that he was not discussed because my family did not know about Dr. Thomas Sowell. I think that in order for Dr. Thomas Sowell to have been discussed over our Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, I think that my family would have to have had some knowledge of him. And so in terms of higher education, I think that someone, and I spent most of my childhood around my mother's side, I think someone over there would had to have had some knowledge of higher education, some knowledge of who the emerging minds were at Harvard, and who was working in think tanks at places like the Hoover Institute. But I also think that though my relatives would have had some interest in knowledge of economics and how economics work, because Dr. Sowell had his training in economics. So I think that there's an education piece to this. I think that there's a socioeconomics piece to this as well. And I think that there's a culture piece to this as well. I just don't think that my people were thinking about economics and taxes and capitalism and versus socialism versus hybrid economies. I don't think my people were thinking about that. But also, I don't remember his name coming up at any of our Black History Month programs at my church. I don't remember his name being mentioned in either of our black newspapers in the city of Buffalo, the Criterion or the Challenger. So I think that, again, someone in my circle would have had to have had a knowledge of this person and a curiosity about this person's topics of interests, or someone in our vicinity would have had to have had an interest in the kinds of things that Dr. Sowell talks about and researches. And in a lot of black families, I don't think there's an interest in those kinds of things. I'm not saying all black families, I'm just saying some, and I know that that comment might get me in a little bit of trouble, but that's just my opinion. So if you haven't, once again, please like this video, as the likes are free. So, going back to my family, not only would those ideas have had to have been introduced, but also the adults would have had to have been open to listening to those ideas and entertaining those ideas. That's very, very important. But there are numerous, if you're unfamiliar with Dr. Thomas Sowell, there are numerous videos on YouTube. There are numerous interviews of him on YouTube. There are numerous panel discussions, some very heated, with him on YouTube. And I just find it fascinating listening to him talk and listening to him talk about his view of his story of growing up in New York City and his version of coming up through the civil rights era. I think it's very, very fascinating because it's very different than what I heard in my own family, and it's different than what we hear in much of the mainstream news and the mainstream media, and it's different from a lot of the history that we're taught as black people. Dr. Sowell rubbed elbows with other well-known economists like Milton Friedman. If you're curious about who that is, there are videos on YouTube as well, and you can read up on him via a quick Google search. But I think one of the things I want to communicate through this is the more you know, the more perspectives you know, the more ideas you know, it changes your thinking, it changes the way you see the world, and it ultimately changes things like how you vote and what you're thinking about when you're voting. Are you voting for a particular party? Are you voting for just because you don't like a certain president? Or are you voting because you understand the policies being discussed and debated on a higher level? So I read Inside of American Education by Dr. Sowell, and I have a copy of Economic Facts and Fallacies myself. This is a very good book, and I'm just going to skim through the chapters here so you can get a feel for what this book is about. Chapter 1, The Power of Fallacies. Chapter 2, Urban Facts and Fallacies. Chapter 3, Male-Female Facts and Fallacies. Chapter 4, Academic Facts and Fallacies. Chapter 5 is Income Facts and Fallacies. Chapter 6 is Racial Facts and Fallacies. Chapter 7 is Third World Facts and Fallacies. And then Chapter 8 is Parting Thoughts. So again, just in general, this is just one of many books that Dr. Sowell has written. But he spends a lot of time analyzing not just economics, but arguments and ideas related to culture, and often debunking the ones that are in large part promoted to us in media and in the mainstream media, or should I say in pop culture and the mainstream media. He spends a lot of time talking about dogma, faulty and suspect social dogmas, and also skewering the intelligentsia. If you're wondering who the intelligentsia are, you can think about the very, very left radical factions at our institutions of higher learning who eventually spill out into larger society and now into politics. People, idealistic people, people with good ideas, people with ideas that they think are good ideas, but are not often founded upon logic or some sort of past precedent. So he spends a lot of time debunking social dogma and the intelligentsia. He's spent time criticizing President Obama, which I think that right there would probably offend a lot of people. But I think he's also criticized Republicans and other conservatives as well. So he's an equal opportunity intellectual. In my home, and so again, in my home and in my church and at my HBCU, in terms of history, we only really heard about slave era black people. We heard about civil rights, the big names in civil rights: Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis. Those people, Ralph Bunche, Medgar Evers. We only heard about those people. We hear about athletes, entertainers, social justice individuals. If we hear about intellectuals, it's usually people like Dr. Michael Eric Dyson and Dr. Cornel West. I'm not saying these aren't smart and competent people, but these are the only people, coming from my background, that we tend to hear about, or that we would hear about. But what about our conservative and our independent thinkers and intellectuals? They weren't talked about as much from where I come from. So I'm going to close this video out by saying that there is a danger to omitting certain people and selectively telling history, and that's that you're not giving a nice, complete picture, and you're only telling one half of that picture. And so the people growing up hearing that storytelling are only going to think that there's one half of that picture, but there's actually a whole. There's a yin and a yang, and there's a right and a left, and there's a light and a dark. And so it's important, in my opinion, to tell the whole history. You have a Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, but you also have a Dr. Thomas Sowell. You have a Dr. Cornel West, but you also have a Dr. Walter Williams. So it's important to tell the whole picture, in my opinion. But the other thing is, when you omit people, you also omit ideas. And in some instances, the ideas you're omitting could be very good ideas. And they could be the very ideas that are needed to lift specific communities of people out of their circumstances. But because they're not exposed to those ideas, they don't know, and they may stay where they are. And when they hear those alternative ways of thinking, they may just shun them away because it's not what they're used to. And some could call that social engineering, where ideas and dogma and values are deliberately radiated might not be the best word, but passed on and used to indoctrinate certain groups of people. By the way, going back to HBCUs, Dr. Claude Anderson actually mentioned that in one of his videos, that there are specific groups who dictate what books HBCUs are going to sell on campus and use in their courses. And so he's been trying to get his books onto the campuses of HBCUs, albeit unsuccessfully up to this point. So Dr. Claude Anderson also wasn't covered much, and I only discovered him because of the work of Dr. Boyce Watkins. Not everybody likes Dr. Boyce Watkins, but he thought it was important to get the word out regarding Dr. Claude Anderson. Dr. Claude Anderson has a lot of good ideas, and all of that, for the most part, was made possible because of the different digital spaces and the technology that we have today. There are other means of getting messages out today. The same is true for Dr. Walter Williams, Dr. Glenn Lowry, and individuals like John McWhorter. I'm not sure if John McWhorter is a doctor as well. I think he is. I think he's a PhD. Dr. Glenn Lowry and Dr. John McWhorter, they have a little podcast of their own. But again, these people just aren't and weren't talked about where I come from, which I think is bad. And I wrote about that in my blog post on Cooning, which I'll probably leave in the description box below as well. So I'm going to close this video out by saying happy belated birthday to Dr. Thomas Sowell. He recently turned 90 years old. So happy birthday to you, sir. And he has written at least 30 books. I did a quick search before I shot this video, and I counted about 50 or so, but there may be more. But he's written a lot of books and created a lot of content regarding economics and just critical thought on social and societal topics. So I'm going to end by saying that good ideas don't have a color. Good ideas don't have a political party, and good ideas don't have a race. And there are dangers to omitting certain people and omitting certain parts of history. And when you do that, you're omitting understanding, and you're omitting story, and you are omitting a lot of good, potentially good ideas. And once again, for someone like me, for the most part, it doesn't matter who the ideas come from if it's a good idea. And I'm not afraid to hear the other person's point of view. So I'm going to stop here. Please like this video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. Please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And as always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Take care, and I'll talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.